A strong message from Capitol Hill. The Senate approving a war powers resolution forcing a full stop to the war with Iran. This amplifying Republican lawmakers' growing concerns over the war and the deal to end it. D.C. Bureau reporter Ross Ketchke leading us off tonight.
On this motion, the yeas are 50, the nays are 48.
Tonight, Congress officially telling President Donald Trump to end the war with Iran. In a 50-48 vote, the Senate passing a war powers resolution aimed at rolling back the commander-in-chief's authority to carry out future strikes on Iran without further approval from Capitol Hill.
More important than the dollars we've lost are the lives that have been lost. 13 U.S. troops.
The move is mostly symbolic and will not carry the weight of federal law, but it is a defeat for President Trump, handed to him by 4 fellow Republicans who crossed party lines in the vote. The move comes days after the U.S. and Iran agreed to a memorandum of understanding, ending the fighting and setting up a new round of negotiations on Tehran's nuclear program. But GOP senators warn even a symbolic step towards taking the military option off the table will undercut those talks.
If this passes, the Iranians are going to simply stand up and walk away from negotiations.
Hey friends, Jack here. So this is what just happened, guys. The Senate, controlled by Republicans, voted to demand Trump halt the war with Iran, with some of his own party crossing over to join Democrats. It wasn't a dramatic removal, but it was a significant public check on presidential power by members of his own team. All right, let's get back to the story, because here is why that detail alone should stop you in your tracks and make you pay attention. In a chamber where Trump's party holds the majority, you normally expect party discipline to hold the line, especially on a foreign policy issue tied directly to the president's own military decisions.
They're going to say this thing's over.
No one knows the details of this so-called understanding.
Meanwhile, Senate Democrats say they're being kept in the dark with no details from the White House about long-term plans to stabilize the Middle East.
The fact of the matter is we don't know where we stand today.
The Pentagon is now asking Congress to approve around $80 billion to pay for the last 3 months of war, including replacing critical munitions. Despite pushback from Democrats, President Trump says he believes the American public is still backing the military action.
Not only do they support it, they demand it because they won't allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon.
And Louis, more on what took place behind the scenes leading up to that war powers vote here on Capitol Hill this afternoon. Republicans had 2 of their senators missing today. If they had been here, it's likely the GOP would have been able to defeat that war powers vote, at least in a 50-50 draw. Those absences very notable today. One of the lawmakers who was not here was Kentucky Republican Senator Mitch McConnell, who's now been hospitalized since last week.
And all this likely to cause even more friction between the president and Senate Republicans. And tomorrow, the president is expected on the Hill to meet with lawmakers behind closed doors about his election reform bill. I mean, the stakes could not be higher. What are you learning tonight?
When that discipline breaks, even partially, it tells you something real is going on beneath the surface. Something worth actually understanding instead of just reacting to a headline that's designed to make you click without thinking. And this wasn't some quiet, buried procedural vote that happened in the middle of the night when nobody was watching. Trump came out swinging afterward. He blasted the vote publicly and called the timing of it meaningless. Now think about that word choice for just a moment. Meaningless. That's a president trying to downplay a vote that clearly bothered him enough to respond to it directly and publicly. When something truly doesn't matter, you don't usually see a president firing back at his own chamber over it with this level of energy and anger.
Yeah, Louis, it certainly is going to be a high-stakes meeting. President Trump coming here to Capitol Hill to discuss what he has dubbed the Save America Act. It is a sweeping election reform law that seeks to introduce items like mandatory voter ID and proof of citizenship to register to vote in all 50 states across the country. Now, this has been a major priority for President Donald Trump for months now, but it's also become a very big headache for the commander-in-chief, and that's because there simply have not been enough votes in the Republican-controlled Senate to pass that bill and send it to his desk to be signed into law. We have learned it was Florida Republican Senator Rick Scott who extended that invitation to President Donald Trump to come to Capitol Hill tomorrow to have this behind closed doors meeting. As we've seen, the Republicans here on Capitol Hill have begun to press back against President Donald Trump on a number of issues, from the war with Iran also to this Save America Election Reform Act. So we'll see if that huddle tomorrow can get the president and his GOP allies back on the same page.
And notice how quickly that response came too. This wasn't some delayed, quiet statement buried in a press release days later when everyone had already moved on. This was a direct public reaction, close enough to the vote itself that it clearly registered as something Trump felt he needed to address head-on rather than just letting it pass by without comment. That immediacy tells you something important about how this vote landed inside the White House. So no, this vote did not end Trump's presidency. Nothing in the Constitution lets Congress do that with a single measure like this one. But, and here is where the real story kicks in and gets genuinely interesting.
We're following breaking news here at noon. The House has once again voted to direct President Donald Trump to end the war with Iran. 4 Republicans joined Democrats to approve a war powers resolution with a final vote 214 to 208. The Senate is expected to vote to advance a similar but separate measure later today. Good afternoon, and thanks so much for joining us here on CBS News Detroit. I'm Rochelle Graham. The House vote comes as injured service members are being flown out of the Middle East to a military hospital in Germany. That's according to a U.S. official and a source familiar with the matter. Natalie Brand is in Washington with the latest developments.
After a 12th consecutive night of U.S. strikes against Iran, CBS News confirms the military has deployed more aerial refuelers to places like Israel. Flight trackers have also shown B-1 bombers leaving bases in the U.K.
Really what they confirm is that the Pentagon is giving the president more options. They don't in and of themselves confirm that there's going to be escalation.
As President Trump made new threats this week to hit Iranian infrastructure.
This vote absolutely rattled things in Washington. It sent shockwaves through the political establishment, and it exposed cracks in Republican unity that a lot of people assumed weren't really there or were just media inventions. And it's worth pointing out right away just how unusual it is for any president to face a vote like this from his own party. Presidents typically count on their own chamber majority to shield them from exactly this kind of pushback, especially on foreign policy and military decisions where party loyalty usually runs deepest. So watching that shield crack, even partially, is genuinely rare political territory, no matter which administration we're talking about.
Iran's foreign minister fired back on social media, warning their defense doctrine is clear, an eye for an eye. Secretary of State Marco Rubio responded this morning.
The president's policy is a head for an eye.
Tensions in the Strait of Hormuz are also spilling into the nearby Red Sea. The Iranian-backed Houthis took responsibility for an attack Wednesday on 2 Saudi oil tankers.
I think by any objective measure, we're worse off than we were before the war.
While the president says his top goal remains preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, the administration just signed a new agreement with Saudi Arabia to build out a civilian nuclear program there. But in a new social media post Thursday, Trump said the deal requires the Saudis to normalize relations with Israel through the Abraham Accords. The Saudi crown prince has previously said that would depend on a roadmap to a Palestinian state.
We want to be part of the Abraham Accord, but we want also to be sure that we secure a clear path of two-state solution.
President Trump also said the deal involves only non-military use, adding there will be no enrichment. Natalie Brand, CBS News, Washington.
This isn't about Trump specifically. This is about the fundamental dynamics of power in Washington and how they shift when something unexpected happens. Let's talk about what this measure actually did, because that matters a lot here, and it's where most people get confused. According to reporting, the vote was designed to force Trump into a choice: either end military action against Iran or go back to Congress and formally seek approval to continue it. That's the real teeth behind this vote. That's what made it genuinely consequential. It wasn't just a symbolic slap on the wrist or a performative gesture designed to generate headlines. It was Congress trying to reassert actual control over a war decision using one of the sharpest tools in its constitutional arsenal. And here's a fact that makes this even bigger than it might sound at first glance. This was the first war powers measure of its kind passed by Congress in years. Not just during Trump's presidency, in years, period. That's a genuinely remarkable statistic that should make you realize this wasn't some routine run-of-the-mill vote that happens all the time. This was Congress pulling out a tool it hasn't really used in a long time, specifically to push back on a sitting president's military decisions. So here is what we're going to do in this video. We're going to break down exactly what this Senate vote said and did, because the details actually matter here, and most people are getting them wrong. We're going to dig into why this created such a visible crack in Republican unity, and what that says about Trump's grip on his own party, heading into the rest of his term. And we're going to talk about what comes next because this fight over war powers is not finished. Not even close. This is an ongoing battle that has implications far beyond just this one vote. Stick around because we're about to dig into the details behind this vote, and honestly, some of it might surprise you. Let's get into it for real this time. Let's slow down and actually walk through this thing because most of what's floating around online skips right past the details that make this story worth paying attention to in the first place. First, let's talk about what a war powers vote actually is, because that term gets thrown around a lot without much explanation, and a lot of people don't really understand what it means. Under the Constitution, Congress is supposed to have real authority over decisions about war, declaring it, funding it, and in some cases, ending it. Over the decades, presidents from both parties have found ways to stretch around that authority, often by framing military actions as something short of a formal war, which lets them avoid needing direct congressional approval. War powers measures are basically Congress's way of pushing back against that stretch. They're a formal tool that lets lawmakers demand a president either stop a specific military action or come back to Congress and get real explicit approval to keep going. It's one of the sharpest tools Congress has for reining in a president's military decisions, and it doesn't get used very often, which is exactly why this vote stood out so much and generated so much attention. Here's some added context that makes this even more significant. These kinds of measures trace all the way back to a law passed in the 1970s, specifically designed to rebalance war powers after Congress felt sidelined during earlier conflicts. Presidents from both parties have pushed back against that law over the decades, often arguing it limits their ability to respond quickly to threats. So every time Congress actually manages to pass one of these measures successfully, it's a real, tangible sign that lawmakers are willing to fight for that authority instead of just talking about it. That law came about after years of frustration in Congress, watching presidents commit troops and military resources to conflicts without ever formally asking for permission first. Lawmakers on both sides eventually agreed something needed to change, which is how this whole framework came into existence in the first place. But here's the catch that makes all of this so fascinating. Having a law on the books and actually using it successfully are two very different things. And for decades, Congress mostly let this tool sit unused, even during major military conflicts. They talked about it, they threatened to use it, but they rarely actually followed through. That's what makes this vote genuinely historic in a way that has nothing to do with the exaggerated headlines. Let's get into the actual vote itself and what happened on that day. The Senate approved this measure demanding Trump halt the war with Iran. And here is the detail that really matters and that most people are missing. This was a Republican-controlled Senate. Trump's own party holds the majority there, yet the measure still passed because some Republicans broke away and joined Democrats to get it through. That's not a small crack. That's a visible split right out in the open on one of the most sensitive issues a president deals with, military action overseas. This wasn't some quiet disagreement behind closed doors. This was a public rebuke broadcast to the entire world. Now let's talk about how Trump responded, because this is honestly one of the most telling parts of the whole story, and it reveals a lot about how he operates under pressure. Trump blasted the vote and specifically called the timing of it meaningless. Think about that response for a second and really analyze it. If a vote truly didn't matter, you'd expect a president to basically ignore it or brush it off with a quick dismissive line and move on to other things. Instead, Trump directly engaged with it, criticized it publicly, and took the time to specifically attack how it was timed. That's not the reaction of someone who sees this as a total non-event that doesn't bother him. And here's why the timing comment matters so much and reveals his actual concern. By calling the timing meaningless, Trump was essentially trying to argue that the vote came too late to actually matter. Maybe because military decisions were already unfolding a certain way regardless of what the Senate wanted. But notice that argument doesn't dispute what the vote said. It just tries to argue the vote doesn't change anything practically. That's a very different response than saying the vote itself was wrong or unjustified on its merits. So here's why most people are misunderstanding this story and why the headlines are so misleading. A lot of headlines are treating this vote like some kind of formal legal step toward removing Trump from office. It is absolutely not that. Nothing about a war powers measure touches impeachment, removal, or shortening a presidential term in any way. Those are completely separate constitutional processes handled through entirely different mechanisms with different rules and different thresholds. This vote is about war authority specifically, not about whether Trump stays in office. It's honestly a pretty simple mix-up once you break it down, but it's an easy one to fall for if you only glance at a headline without reading further. A vote against the president's war decision gets flattened down into a vote against the president himself, and from there, it's a short jump to imagining that vote somehow threatens his entire term. That leap just isn't supported by anything in the actual reporting or the constitutional framework. But here's the part that actually deserves way more attention than it's getting and that most people are completely missing. This measure forced Trump into a real binary choice, at least on paper. According to reporting, he either had to end military action against Iran or formally go back to Congress and seek approval to continue it. That's not nothing. That's Congress using real leverage to try to shape an active military decision, which is exactly the kind of check the Constitution intended Congress to have in the first place. It's the system working the way it was designed to work, or at least trying to. And let's go back to that detail about this being the first of its kind in years, because it's honestly one of the most important facts in this entire story. This was the first war powers measure of its kind passed by Congress in years. Not just during this administration, in years period across multiple presidencies from both parties. Think about how rare that actually is and what it says about the current political moment. Congress has the formal power to do this kind of thing constantly, but rarely actually uses it. Mostly because it requires enough lawmakers, often from the president's own party, to be willing to break ranks publicly on a military issue. So when that finally happens, and it happens against a sitting president from the very party that controls the chamber, that's genuinely newsworthy without needing any exaggeration at all. This isn't Congress doing something routine. This is Congress reaching for one of its sharpest, least used tools and actually getting enough votes to make it happen. And here's a bigger picture point that puts all of this in perspective. Military conflicts involving Iran have flared up repeatedly over the years under multiple different administrations, and Congress has almost always deferred to the president's judgment on how to respond. That pattern of deference is exactly what makes this vote stand out so sharply. It broke from decades of Congress mostly staying out of the way once military action was already underway. And that alone should tell you this wasn't some minor procedural blip in an otherwise quiet news cycle. This was a genuine departure from business as usual. Look back at previous administrations for a second, and you'll notice the same basic pattern repeating over and over again. Lawmakers occasionally introduce war powers measures during tense military moments. They generate some headlines, and then they usually stall out or fail to gather enough votes to actually pass. That's been the norm for a long time now across both parties, which is exactly why an actual successful vote like this one carries so much more weight than the usual attempts that fizzle out along the way. The difference between introducing a measure and actually passing it is enormous, and that's what makes this moment genuinely historic. Now let's talk about the Republican unity angle for a second, because this might actually be the most politically significant part of this whole story, and the part that has the longest lasting implications. For Trump specifically, maintaining tight control over his own party in the Senate has been a major part of how he's operated and how he's maintained power. When Republicans start peeling off on a major foreign policy vote like this one, that's a visible crack in that control. One that opponents can point to as evidence that his grip on Washington isn't as absolute as it might look from the outside. Think about what it actually takes for a Republican senator to break from Trump on a vote like this. These are lawmakers who typically rely on staying in line with him for support back home, for fundraising, for political cover in their own primaries. So when enough of them decide the war powers issue matters more than staying in lockstep, That tells you this wasn't some minor disagreement. It suggests real substantive concern about how this military action has been handled, concern serious enough to risk friction with the president over it. It's worth remembering, too, that political cover works both ways. A senator who breaks with Trump publicly on something like this is making a calculated bet that voters back home will see it as principled leadership on a serious military matter rather than as disloyalty to the party. That's not a decision lawmakers make lightly, which is exactly why enough of them making that same bet at the same time is such a notable signal. And that's honestly probably where the panic framing in that viral headline is coming from. Not because Trump is panicking about losing his job, but because a vote like this signals that his own party isn't fully lined up behind him on a sensitive military decision. That's a real meaningful kind of political vulnerability, even if it has nothing to do with actually ending his presidency. So let's recap before we move into the deeper breakdown and analysis. This Senate vote did not end Trump's presidency, and nothing about it legally threatens his term in office. But it was a real rare war powers measure passed by his own party's controlled Senate, demanding he either halt military action against Iran or come back to Congress for approval. Trump responded publicly, called the vote's timing meaningless, and this whole episode exposed a visible split in Republican unity on a major foreign policy issue. All right. Let's move into the breakdown where we lay out exactly what this means, who's actually affected, and what to watch for as this fight over war powers keeps playing out. Okay, so let's break this down into simple, clear pieces because there's a lot riding on this one, even without the exaggerated ending his presidency framing. What actually happened was that the Republican-controlled Senate approved a measure demanding Trump halt the war with Iran. Some Republicans crossed over to join Democrats to get it passed. That's the core confirmed fact here. A real vote, a real result, and real cracks in party unity, all on the record. No exaggeration needed to make that fact interesting on its own. How Trump responded is equally important. He blasted the vote and called its timing meaningless. That's a direct public reaction from Trump himself, and it tells you this vote clearly registered with him, even if he tried to downplay its practical impact afterward. A dismissive comment like that still counts as engagement, and it's worth remembering that presidents rarely bother publicly attacking votes. They genuinely consider irrelevant. What the measure actually demanded is the most important part. Reporting described this as forcing Trump into a choice. Either end military action against Iran or go back to Congress and formally seek approval to continue it. That's real substantive leverage, not just a symbolic statement. That's Congress trying to directly shape an active military decision using one of its sharpest constitutional tools and putting the president in a position where doing nothing wasn't really an option. Why this vote stands out historically is crucial to understanding its significance. This was the first war powers measure of its kind passed by Congress in years. That's a genuinely rare event, and it tells you this wasn't some routine partisan skirmish. It was Congress reaching for a tool it almost never successfully uses, and actually getting it through against the president from the very party controlling that chamber. So let's talk about why this actually matters beyond just correcting an exaggerated headline. This story is really about the balance of power between Congress and the presidency when it comes to military decisions. For years, presidents from both parties have found ways around needing direct congressional approval for military action. A vote like this one is a rare visible pushback against that pattern, and it happened specifically against a president whose own party controls the chamber that passed it. Think about the precedent this sets regardless of how this particular Iran situation ends up resolving. Once a chamber successfully passes a war powers measure against a president from his own party, that becomes a reference point for future fights. Lawmakers who want to push back on a future military action under this administration or a future one now have a recent concrete example to point to, showing that this kind of pushback is actually possible, not just theoretical. And think about who actually benefits from a moment like this. Lawmakers who want to reassert congressional authority over war decisions get a real concrete example to point to going forward. It shows that when enough members are willing to break from their party, These war powers measures can actually pass even under a president from their own side. That strengthens the argument for using this tool again in future conflicts, regardless of which party holds the White House. On the other side, this creates a real challenge for Trump. Losing control over even a portion of his own party's Senate votes on a sensitive foreign policy issue is not a good look heading into future legislative fights. It gives critics a very real, very concrete talking point about cracks in his political control, even without any of the exaggerated ending his presidency language attached to it. And here's who loses out if people only pay attention to the fake exaggerated version of this story. You do as the viewer because you miss the actual significance of what happened here. This wasn't about Trump's term getting shortened. It was about Congress reasserting a rarely used constitutional check over military action and about visible cracks forming in party unity on a major foreign policy issue. That's a substantial story on its own, and it deserves to be understood accurately without all the noise and distortion. And here's one more group worth mentioning because they're rarely part of this conversation. Everyday people affected by ongoing military action overseas and by the political fallout here at home are the ones ultimately impacted by how this all plays out. Whether Congress successfully reins in a military decision, or whether that pushback ends up being mostly symbolic, has real consequences beyond just Washington politics. It shapes how future conflicts get handled and how much say elected lawmakers actually have when military action drags on. So here's the honest, no-spin bottom line. Trump's presidency was never actually on the line here, but a Republican-controlled Senate did pass a rare war powers measure demanding he halt military action against Iran. Some of his own party senators broke ranks to make that happen, and Trump publicly pushed back by calling the vote's timing meaningless. That's a real significant political story, and it doesn't need a fake ending his presidency headline to make it worth watching. This matters right now because war powers fights like this one tend to resurface whenever military decisions drag on without clear congressional buy-in. If tensions with Iran continue, expect more of these measures, more public clashes between Trump and members of his own party, and more scrutiny over exactly how far a president can stretch military authority without going back to Congress first. The Senate's war powers vote is a significant check on Trump, but its real impact depends on whether the administration actually changes military course or ignores it. Watch for more Republicans breaking ranks on foreign policy. If this becomes a trend, it signals a broader erosion of Trump's influence over his own party.